Maybe it will let me record. All right. So welcome. Thanks for coming to Detective Fiction. Um, so have you been, I hope you've been able to kick around the Canvas shell. I tried to organize it in a pretty straightforward way to make it easy. The class goes super fast. We've only got 13 technically class days because we've got Monday was a holiday and then MLK Day is a holiday. And I took a reading out for that reason, which kind of scrunched things a little bit. But these are organized by day, and you can just hit one. You could wake up in the morning and look at the day and do the work for that day and feel like you're on a pretty good pace for the course. The couple of things I'd like to draw your attention to, even though it may seem early, are to go ahead and look at the assignment for the midterm, because it's open, it's there, and you can start sort of thinking as you read the stories that you're reading, which ones might be most interesting for you to write about. And go ahead and look at the final paper too. You can already be thinking whether you want to try to write an analysis or a creative one. Like, you have an option for your final to create your own detective fiction. So if that appeals to you, then you might want to be thinking about it now and taking notes and looking at stories you like as mentor texts to try to help you sort through it. The intro video kind of goes through everything and how it's all organized. So I'll just direct you back there if you're curious about assignments or schedules. If there's any link that's broken or anything you can't get to, you can let me know. I suppose I should have said I'm Dr. Garcia. I'm your professor. I'm very good by email, although I am out of state right now, so I'm not checking it quite as often. I'm excellent by text. If you email me and you don't hear from me for a day, this class goes quickly enough that might bother you, and you might actually need an answer quicker than that. My cell phone is on the syllabus and it's here too, and I'm just better by text. I don't usually answer a number if I don't recognize it, but you can text me and tell me who you are and give me your question. And if my phone isn't dead, I'll answer you right away. Or if I'm not asleep. Those are the only two conditions under which I don't answer a text almost immediately. Maybe if I don't know the answer, sometimes I drag my feet about answering it because I don't know and I have to look around, and then I don't always get right back to it when I find the answer, if I'm not able to go find the answer right then. But if you have questions or concerns, or something happens and you're not going to be able to turn things in for a couple of days and you're worried about it crashing your progress in the course, just reach out to me and we can work it out. I feel confident we can work it out. So I've divided the class up into 3 eras. You don't have to approach detective fiction that way. There are lots of other ways you could think about detective fiction and how it's organized. You could look at, well, there are lots of other ways you could do it, but I, for simplicity's sake, have divided it into 3 basically chronological eras. And we start at the beginning with classical era detective fiction. Let me do this real quick. So detective fiction has its roots in lots of related genres, particularly true crime, gothic, and mystery stories. But there are some differences that set it apart. True crime is factual, so that's an obvious difference right away. But it's often presented as sensational, which just means it's trying to get your attention. Let me move this down here. Trying to present the true crime in the most sort of attention-grabbing way, right? It appeals to your senses. It appeals to your sense of horror, your sense of visual, your sense of sort of hearing and smell. It really does something to grab your attention. And in that sense, that it gets very dramatic, right? True crime being presented as very dramatic. Gothic literature has several identifying elements. including seemingly supernatural events, uncanny moments, and a dark tone that produces a feeling of dread. It skews more toward romance and horror. And mystery stories don't necessarily have a detective figure, amateur or otherwise. They sometimes allow for supernatural elements as well. And what we'll talk about as we get into the contemporary era and you start watching, you choose your own television show to watch and your own movie to watch, is that a lot of the ways detective fiction is the genre is being expanded today in the contemporary era is by mashing it up with other genres. And so you get a detective story that also has more prominent romance elements, or a detective story that has some pretty serious horror elements woven into it, or a detective story that is almost like a coming of age, like the Enola Holmes or Wednesday series, right? There's something, the way the genre is growing right now, sort of post-contemporary era, I guess, in the way I've got it divided here, is that it's being remixed with other genres, and that's allowing the detective story to say a little something different than maybe it has before. If you go to Google Ngram, if you get curious about other terms and where they appeared in history, Google has scanned thousands and thousands and thousands of books, but also magazines, news articles, lots of things. And you can go to Ngram and you can find the frequency of different words. And so I went and I searched for detective, and you can see that there's not much of an occurrence here. And then in the 1850s, it starts to climb, and it spikes up here in the 1930s or so. And we have a little bit of a dip, and then it starts coming back up. And this is one way to think about the different eras of detective fiction. We have the very first, what we recognize as detective stories, appearing in the 1850s. And I'll talk a little bit about what those are. And then we've got the hard-boiled era that peaks in the 30s and 40s. And then we've got contemporary police procedurals that are popular now. And so you can sort of see how detective shows up in literature as a result. I have no idea what happened in the 1650s that made it blip there. Something weird. So maybe I'll do some research into it and figure it out. So I'm going to talk about a few of the writers of the Golden Age or the Classical era that we're going to read. We're going to start with Edgar Allan Poe. He's considered the inventor of the detective story, though he only wrote 3, and all of them feature the same detective, C. Auguste Dupin. And that's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which we read, The Mystery of Marie Roget, and The Purloined Letter. I actually like The Purloined Letter best. It's my favorite of the 3 because it's got a clever device that I like. But Murders in the Rue Morgue was the first, and it introduces the detective. And you can see how the way he set up a detective still is recognizable in detective stories that we see today, even the contemporary ones. So he really did some strong work for the detective genre. And when you read Murders in the Rue Morgue, you'll notice it's split into 6 or 7 parts. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was published that way in little pieces. And at the beginning of each part, it does a little recap, sort of like last week on the Murders in the Rue Morgue, right? It does a little paragraph intro that helps recap what happened before. So you might think of that as you read, if it seems confusing, that could be part of why it's doing that recap. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote Sherlock Holmes, the Sherlock Holmes stories. He was never very fond of Sherlock. He did it for money. He wanted to be a famous, important novelist. He wanted to write important novels. He didn't think Sherlock counted as important novels. They're formulaic, they have a certain pattern. And he famously told people that they could marry him, murder him, do whatever you wanted to with his character. He was not protective of it at all, of his copyright. And the copyright just lapsed at the beginning of this year. So for a while, some of the Sherlock Holmes stories were in public domain and some of them were not. And now all of them are officially in the public domain, which just means that they can be adapted or changed or played with without worrying about violating copyright. And that's usually a good boost for a lot of creative work with Sherlock Holmes. But because he was so lax about keeping the copyright or enforcing it before, people have already done lots of adaptations of it. He's known as the most adapted character in fiction in history, right? Sherlock Holmes is the most represented and adapted character in fiction. I think we've got in here. Yeah, he published his last Holmes story in 1927. He killed him off in 1893. He was like, maybe I could just be done with this and not do it anymore. But then he needed money again. And so in 1901, they brought it back up. But a very important figure, one we all recognize as the prototypical detective. And they had a funeral in the streets of London for him when the final problem was published in the paper. So an important character. Dame Agatha Christie, also bright star in the detective genre, best known for Hercule Poirot. So if you saw Murder on the Orient Express or Death on the Nile, two recent adaptations that Kenneth Branagh did, those have been made several different times, and that they feature Hercule Poirot. Hercule Poirot is the only fictional character to ever have an obituary in the New York Times. When she killed him off, they published an obituary for him as if he were a real person in the New York Times. So people take their detectives very seriously. So Miss Marple is the character that we're going to read for her. Oh, I guess I should have mentioned Conan Doyle's we read The Speckled Band for Conan Doyle for Sherlock, and it is one of my favorites. It's got a clever result, and Sherlock does a few things that I won't say they're out of character, but there's a little surprising to me as a reader, and they come up in one or two other stories, but not very often. So it's a nice sort of intro to the range of what he can be like. So Miss Marple, we're going to read The Tuesday Night Club, which was in the 13 Problems. So we read the first appearance of Miss Marple. She disappeared, not Miss Marple, Agatha Christie, for 11 days in 1926, and no one's ever figured out what happened. She just disappeared. She showed up in a different place 11 days later and professed not to know what had happened. And you can watch lots of stuff on YouTube about that if you get interested. All of these characters are really interesting. Conan Doyle had a strong belief in fairies. He took photographs that he thought fairies appeared in and, swore they were real and tried to investigate that his entire life. Edgar Allan Poe, of course, had lots of crazy life stories going on there and ended up dead at a fairly young age, presumably from opium-related pneumonia or some combination of being ill and being and overdosing. Dorothy Sayers is best known for her amateur detective, Lord Peter Wimsey, an English aristocrat who first appeared in Whose Body. The Lord Peter Wimsey stories are set between the First and Second World Wars, and so there's a lot of interesting interwar 1920s politics going on in them and sort of reflection. I cut Dorothy Sayers' stories from the syllabus. She was our sacrifice to make sure that the days were not too overwhelming, but it is still in the reading files. If you're curious about it, you could read The Haunted Policeman. So the classical era has a particular feel to it. As you read these stories, you need to be making notes about what that feeling is and what produces it. Sometimes they get called cozy mysteries, right? There's something comforting about them. There's a predictable rhythm. You know that the detective is going to set the scene right and that everything's going to work out well in the end. In many ways, a close reading, which is kind of the work of this class for you to produce a couple of different close readings, is a kind of detective work. You're identifying small clues, you're conducting research, and you're drawing conclusions. So you should look for things that you have questions about, things that you like or that you don't like. Sometimes it's easier to write about something you don't like if you see a character do something you don't like, or an exchange between characters that you think that makes you uncomfortable. That's a good place to look at it for a close reading. Detective fiction, quite often authors use stereotypes around race and gender and class in order to throw the reader off. So you'll read a character stereotyping other characters based on their race or their gender, or you'll see maybe hints of their sexuality that are supposed to make them suspicious for one reason or another. And so when you read those, it's easy sometimes as a contemporary reader, as a modern reader, to say, oh, well, they were stupid back then, or they were mean back then, or they had weird race and racist ideas, race science and racist ideas, or gender ideas back then that we don't have anymore. But many of these thinkers were quite modern, and they're using that to misdirect the reader, right? The idea is that you as the reader will follow what some of the characters think, or they'll produce a little bit of dramatic irony, because you'll see characters dismiss somebody because of their ethnic background or their gender or their sex. And you as the reader will know that they're making a mistake, right? And that produces a particular kind of feeling in you as a reader. When you know something that the characters don't, you see the characters making a mistake, you know it's a mistake. And that's one way to engage you as a reader. So anytime you come across something like that, it's worth taking a minute to note where it happens and what you're thinking, because it's probably a good candidate for a close reading, right? To try to figure out why the author put that conversation or that event in that place and what it was supposed to do for you as a reader. There are other authors that we can include in our study of the golden age. This is often called the golden age of fiction, detective fiction, especially if we expanded to include novels, which we don't have time to do in the next 3 weeks. Wilkie Collins would certainly be on the reading list. When I teach this class in person over the course of a semester, we read Wilkie Collins, who's credited with the first detective fiction, although you can make arguments about whether he holds that title legitimately or not. Maybe Charles Dickens, G.K. Chesterton, Ellery Queen, Guy Marsh, just to name a few. In other words, there's more to read if you're interested. If you like cozy mysteries, you like Agatha Christie, Sherlock Holmes, there's lots and lots of other authors we could find to try to sort of scratch that itch. And so we should take these authors as just the tip of the icebergs. These are the ones that got so popular and so famous that they really breached the surface of popular culture, and everybody kind of knows. If they don't know who they are, haven't read them, they know what kind of stories they write. Another advantage these particular authors have chosen for us is that they've been widely adapted, right? Lots of television shows, lots of movies, lots of film adaptations. As you think toward your final paper, one thing you could do for close reading is conduct an analysis where you compare one of these original works to a screen adaptation. So that's something to be thinking about. And yeah, that's where we are for this week. You've got, let's see, maybe I should look really quickly. Back to yeah. So this week, you've read Soatos and Borges' Rules for Detective Fiction. The Soatos piece is great, and it's especially useful when you get closer to the final and you're analyzing something that's more contemporary. I will caution you for the midterm not to try to do Soatos and Sherlock. Soatos built his list based on Sherlock Holmes. So if you say, I'm going to compare and see if Sherlock meets all the criteria of Soatos lists, you end up kind of writing in a circle, right? Soatos read Sherlock, he made the list. You read Sherlock, you connect it to Soatos, and there's not really anything for you to claim or argue there or analyze there. You're just identifying that he was right? That his elements that he put forward are right. There is a case to be made that you could read the way Sherlock departs from Soatos' list, because he does a little bit, I think, in the particular story I've given you. So that you could probably do in 2 pages. But if you try to show how he meets the list, you're setting yourself up for a disaster, because the list was made from him. So of course he meets it. Then there's nothing else to discuss, right? Most of you have already posted to Padlet. You're here in Zoom. That's great. I'll post this video after it renders and stuff. It'll be there in the morning. And that's day one. And then you've got Poe tomorrow and some video background. These videos are really good. It's not like I quiz you on them or anything, but they're good for giving you ideas about what to write about in the discussion posts and maybe what to write about for your midterm and your final. And none of them are terribly long. I think most of them are, I don't know, 10 to 20 minutes. The videos and the two podcasts that I have linked here. And then I think I have one, maybe two slightly longer ones that you can sort of, it's not like you've got to memorize them for a test, but put them on at the gym or something and let them give you some ideas about what to write about. And then the rest of this week, we've got Sherlock Holmes. And then here's sort of a documentary about Conan Doyle and his feelings toward Sherlock Holmes. Agatha Christie, A Drunk History, that's optional. And I'll put them on there if they're optional, a drunk history version of what happened to her those 11 days. And then that's it for this week because I let Sayers go. So do any of you, what questions do you have at this stage? Those of you who are here and speaking on behalf of the rest of the class. All clear and good? All right. The Canvas shell is meant to be, yeah. I don't know why it thinks you're the speaker. It just wants to. The Canvas shell is meant to be like clear, straightforward, and easy to do. Because I put things in Google Drive and in Canvas and in other places, the likelihood that I've got a link, a wire crossed somewhere is pretty high. If you click on something and it looks like the wrong date or not what it says it was on the tin or something like that, shoot me an email and I'll fix it. There's nothing in here that should be tricky or confusing. If it is, then I've made a mistake, and then someone should let me know so that I can fix it. And